This is part 2 of chapter 17 of Jane Eyre. Mrs. Fairfax had just been telling Jane that this is one of the longest times that Mr. Rochester has stayed at Thornfield consecutively, and they're getting ready to meet Mr. Rochester's guests. It was with some trepidation that I perceived the hour approach when I was to repair with my charge to the drawing-room. Adele had been in a state of ecstasy all day after hearing she was to be presented to the ladies in the evening, and it was not till Sophie commenced the operation of dressing her that she sobered down. Then the importance of the process quickly steadied her, and by the time she had her curls arranged in well-smoothed, drooping clusters, her pink satin frock put on, her long sash tied, and her lace mittens adjusted, she looked as grave as any judge. No need to warn her not to disarrange her attire. When she was dressed, she sat demurely down in her little chair, taking care previously to lift up the satin skirt for fear she should crease it, and assured me she would not stir thence till I was ready. This I quickly was. My best dress, the silver grey one, purchased for Miss Temple's wedding and never worn since, was soon put on. My hair was soon smoothed, my sole ornament, the pearl brooch, soon assumed. We descended. Fortunately, there was another entrance to the drawing-room than that through the saloon where they were all seated at dinner. We found the apartment vacant, a large fire burning silently on the marble hearth, and wax candles shining in bright solitude amid the exquisite flowers with which the tables were adorned. The crimson curtain hung before the arch. Slight as was the separation this drapery formed from the party in the adjoining saloon, they spoke in so low a key that nothing of their conversation could be distinguished beyond a soothing murmur. So Jane and Adele enter this room where they're also supposed to meet through a private entrance to avoid making a kind of a spectacle of entering, as Mrs. Fairfax had warned. Walking kind of past everyone may be a little bit awkward. Adele, who appeared to be still under the influence of a most solemnizing impression, sat down without a word on the footstool I pointed out to her. I retired to a window seat, and taking a book from a table near, endeavored to read. Adele brought her stool to my feet. Ere long, she touched my knee. "What is it, Adele?" "May I just take one of these magnificent flowers, just to add the finishing touch to my outfit?" "You think too much of your toilette or her outfit, Adele, but you may have a flower." And I took a rose from a vase and fastened it in her sash. She sighed a sigh of ineffable satisfaction, as if her cup of happiness were now full. I turned my face away to conceal a smile I could not suppress. There was something ludicrous as well as painful in the little Parisienne's earnest and innate devotion to matters of dress. So Adele is very serious about this meeting. She is taking care not to wrinkle her skirt. She's very solemn. She's as solemn as a judge, very imposing and kind of just flat-faced because she's so serious about this, and she's very careful about asking if she can take a flower, and she does this so solemnly that Jane thinks this is kind of hilarious. I'm sure you could all think of moments where you've had to kind of hide a smile from a little kid when they're doing something funny, but they don't think it's funny, so Jane just kind of turns away and doesn't let Adele see that she's kind of laughing at her. A soft sound of rising now became audible. The curtain was swept back from the arch. Through it appeared the dining room, with its lit luster pouring down light on the silver and glass of a magnificent dessert service covering a long table. A band of ladies stood in the opening. They entered, and the curtain fell behind them. There were but 8, yet somehow, as they flocked in, they gave the impression of a much larger number. Some of them were very tall, many were dressed in white, and all had a sweeping amplitude of array that seemed to magnify their persons as a mist magnifies the moon. I rose and curtsied to them. 1 or 2 bent their heads in return, the others only stared at me. So these very elegant, wealthy, or perhaps we know Lord Ingram's estate may not be that profitable for his daughters, but these very noble, kind of well-bred, elegant ladies seem a little bit imposing and intimidating to Jane, so she says that when they come in, it seems like there's more of them than they really are, and it seems like their clothes kind of make them more splendid than they would be otherwise. So they're very impressive, and I think Jane's a little intimidated by that. They dispersed about the room, reminding me, by the lightness and buoyancy of their movements, of a flock of white plumy birds. Some of them threw themselves in half-reclining positions on the sofas and ottomans, some bent over the tables and examined the flowers and books. The rest gathered in a group round the fire. All talked in a low but clear tone, which seemed habitual to them. I knew their names afterwards, and may as well mention them now. First, there was Mrs. Eshton and 2 of her daughters. She had evidently been a handsome woman, and was well preserved still. Of her daughters, the eldest, Amy, was rather little. Naive and childlike in face and manner, and piquant in form, her white muslin dress and blue sash became her well. The second Louisa was taller and more elegant in figure, with a very pretty face. Of that order the French term Ménage chiffonné, both sisters were fair as lilies. Lady Lynn was a large and stout personage of about 40, very erect, very haughty-looking, richly dressed in a satin robe of changeful sheen. Her dark hair shone glossily under the shade of an azure plume, and within the circlet of a band of gems. Mrs. Colonel Dent was less showy, but I thought more ladylike. She had a slight figure, a pale, gentle face, and fair hair. Her black satin dress, her scarf of rich foreign lace, and her pearl ornaments pleased me better than the rainbow radiance of the titled dame. But the three most distinguished, partly perhaps because the tallest figures of the band, were the Dowager Lady Ingram and her daughters, Blanche and Mary. They were all three of the loftiest stature of women. The Dowager might be between 40 and 50. Her shape was still fine, her hair, by candlelight at least, still black. Her teeth, too, were still apparently perfect. Most people would have termed her a splendid woman of her age. And so she was, no doubt, physically speaking. But then there was an expression of almost insupportable haughtiness in her bearing and countenance. She had Roman features and a double chin, disappearing into a throat like a pillar. These features appeared to me not only inflated and darkened, but even furrowed with pride, and the chin was sustained by the same principle, in a position of almost preternatural erectness. She had likewise a fierce and a hard eye. It reminded me of Mrs. Reed's. She mouthed her words in speaking. Her voice was deep, its inflections very pompous, very dogmatical, very intolerable, in short. A crimson velvet robe and a shawl turban of some gold-wrought Indian fabric invested her, I suppose she thought, with a truly imperial dignity. So, the dowager, so the mother of the Ingram daughters, is very proud and haughty and really carries herself in a very almost obnoxious way. We haven't heard her speak yet, so we maybe can't say that for sure. But she does remind Jane of Mrs. Reed, which is not a very flattering comparison. You have these other ladies who are also very, again, wealthy and noble. Lady Lynn, and you have Mrs. Colonel Dent, so she's the wife of a colonel, so she calls herself Mrs. Colonel Dent, and Mrs. Eshton as well. So all of these people are within that group of guests. Blanche and Mary were of equal stature, straight and tall as poplars. Mary was too slim for her height, but Blanche was molded like a Diane. I regarded her, of course, with special interest. First, I wished to see whether her appearance accorded with Mrs. Fairfax's description. Secondly, whether it at all resembled the fancy miniature I had painted of her. And thirdly, it will out, whether it were such as I should fancy likely to suit Mr. Rochester's taste. So Jane is kind of sizing up Blanche Ingram to see if she's a rival for Mr. Rochester's affections. Mary's a little bit too slim for her height, so she's kind of tall, but like maybe not the best proportioned, Jane kind of thinks, so maybe a little bit lanky. And then Blanche Ingram is molded like a Diane, so she's referencing Diana, the Greek goddess. So that's a pretty flattering way to look if someone says that she looks like a Greek goddess. As far as person went, she answered point for point, both to my picture and Mrs. Fairfax's description. The noble bust, the sloping shoulders, the graceful neck, the dark eyes and black ringlets were all there, but her face was like her mother's, a youthful, unfurrowed likeness, the same low brow, the same high features, the same pride. It was not, however, so saturnine a pride. She laughed continually, her laugh was satirical, and so was the habitual expression of her arch and haughty lip. So Blanche likewise looks very proud and haughty, but she has a little bit more of a sense of humor, but it may not be like a good-natured sort of sense of humor because she seems to be satirical. So she seems to make fun of things, but make fun of them perhaps in a more harsh and less gentle way. So watch for that. Genius is said to be self-conscious. I cannot tell whether Miss Ingram was a genius, but she was self-conscious, remarkably self-conscious indeed. She entered into a discourse on botany with the gentle Mrs. Dent. It seemed Mrs. Dent had not studied the science, though as she said she liked flowers, especially wild ones. Miss Ingram had, and she ran over its vocabulary with an air. I presently perceived she was, in what is vernacularly termed, trailing Mrs. Dent, that is, playing on her ignorance. Her trail might be clever, but it was decidedly not good-natured. She played, her execution was brilliant, she sang, her voice was fine, she talked French apart to her mamma, and she talked it well, with fluency and with a good accent. So, On the good side, Blanche is very talented, so she speaks French well, she sings well, and she also plays piano quite well. But she's kind of making fun of Mrs. Dent without Mrs. Dent realizing it. She starts talking about botany, so like the science of plants, and Mrs. Dent doesn't really know that, but Blanche knows it, so she's kind of like showing Mrs. Dent up with how much she knows, and Jane can tell what she's doing, and Jane thinks that it's very clever, but it's not very nice. Mary had a milder, more open countenance than Blanche, softer features too, and a skin some shades fairer. Miss Ingram was dark as a Spaniard. But Mary was deficient in life. Her face lacked expression, her eye luster. She had nothing to say, and having once taken her seat, remained fixed like a statue in its niche. The sisters were both attired in spotless white. So Mary seems a little bit more milder and nice, but she's not really that interesting.